Hello lovelies, in this video Tim is going to be summarising the whole unit on attachment for your AQA A-level psychology. Now make notes as you're going along in this and you'll notice that there is a lot for you to remember. A lot of who did what when. To help you with all of those remembering bits that you need to do so you're ready to apply it in your exam, over my website there is a massive course full of loads and loads of questions to help you revise.
As with many key terms in psychology, attachment is a surprisingly difficult word to define. There are actually many different types of attachment, but for the purposes of AS and A-level psychology, we focus on the attachment that forms between children or babies and their primary caregiver. Most often, but not always, that will be the mother. We can therefore define attachment as a strong emotional bond that forms between an infant and their primary caregiver. As we said, this primary caregiver can often be taken to be the mother of the infant, but this is not always the case, especially in the modern world. And a primary caregiver can be a father, grandparent, nanny, older sibling, or even just another adult. Caregiver-infant interactions have several common features. The first is sensitive responsiveness. The caregiver responds to signals given from the infant. The second is imitation. The infant copies and mimics the actions of the caregiver. As the caregiver makes a noise or facial expression, the infant will often mimic it. The third is interactional synchrony. The infant's reactions are in time to the speech of the caregiver. The fourth is reciprocity, often known as turn-taking. That is, that there is a back-and-forth interaction between the infant and the caregiver. And the fifth is motherese. The caregiver adopts a slow, sing-song way of speaking to the infant, something which incidentally many of us do with our pets. In 1964, two psychologists called Schaffer and Emerson carried out landmark research into attachment. Through this, several stages of attachment were identified and named. This research is considered excellent and extremely reliable, but it didn't take into account cross-cultural differences. All of the infants studied were from Glasgow. They were therefore all isolated to one culture. In total, 4 stages were identified. The first stage is the pre-attachment, or asocial phase, which for most infants lasts from birth through to about 3 months old. During this phase, the infant learns to separate humans from inanimate objects and other animals, but has no obvious displayed feelings about who provides for its basic physical needs, like food, for example. The second phase is the indiscriminate, sometimes known as the diffuse phase, which usually lasts from about 6 weeks old to about 7 months. During this phase, the infant is able to distinguish between different people. To an extent, the infant can also display recognition signals to certain people it sees on a regular basis, but there's still no displayed feelings about who provides care, and the infant is effectively indiscriminate. The third is the discriminate or single attachment phase, which for most infants lasts from 7 months to 11 months old. In this phase, the infant becomes able to form a single, strong attachment with a single specific person, usually the mother. The baby is likely to also be very hesitant around or very scared of strangers, and the infant will usually show recognition signals when this single caregiver is present. The fourth and final phase is known as the multiple attachment phase, which is from usually about 9 months onwards. During this phase, the infant can form several concurrent attachments at the same time with several different individuals. These varying attachments may have different strengths, and they have different purposes, but the number of possible attachments, at least in theory, is infinite. A psychologist called Lorenz was a pioneer in the field of attachment psychology. But, like many experiments done in this area, this particular piece of research controversially used animals. The use of animals in all science, but especially in psychology, was and remains today a topic of high feeling and intense debate. On the one hand, it can provide useful insights which can't be gained from human studies. The issue, however, is that on the other hand it raises severe ethical issues. Animals can never give informed consent, and they may well be harmed physically or mentally by the process. In 1935, Lorenz studied geese, and he found that newly born geese or goslings formed an attachment to the very first moving thing they saw upon hatching, and they then followed it around apparently endlessly. Lorenz called this process imprinting. Lorenz used two separate groups of goslings. One group was born entirely normally and naturally, but the other group was incubated without the presence of an adult goose. Lorenz noticed that the incubated goslings still followed adult geese around. He concluded, therefore, that imprinting happened very swiftly after birth, roughly between 6 and 12 hours. Lorenz concluded that after this tiny period had elapsed, imprinting couldn't happen. While this research is very interesting, it is also of slightly limited use. It's extremely unlikely that any kind of imprinting like this could take place in humans. Unlike geese, our development takes a much longer time, and it tends to be based more around the quality and quantity of care we receive, rather than just latching on to the first moving thing. Another key study done into attachment was done by Harlow in 1959. As we'll see, this animal study also has extremely severe ethical issues. Often, this 1959 study is called the contact comfort study. The aim was to try and find out if infant monkeys preferred a source of nourishment or a source of physical comfort. In a series of laboratory experiments, a group of rhesus monkeys were raised in isolation. They had no contact whatsoever with other rhesus monkeys, but they did have two surrogate mothers. One was made of a hard wire mesh, but it contained a food source. The other was made of a soft and comforting cloth, but did not contain a food source. The infant monkeys spent the vast majority of their time with the soft cloth surrogate. Usually, they only went near the hard wire surrogate in order to obtain food. Unfortunately, as the monkey infants grew into adult monkeys, they showed increasing signs of severe psychological disturbance. Any female infant monkeys became violent parents themselves. Often, this is known as a cycle of privation, something which we'll look at slightly later on. This study seemed to show that infant monkeys, at least, prefer a comforting attachment figure over one that meets their basic physical needs, like food. Obviously, there are huge ethical issues with this study. Infant monkeys were essentially subjected to sustained and deliberate psychological harm. It was a laboratory study done under laboratory conditions, and there was excellent control over the many variables present. Because of this, however, there is very limited ecological validity, and it can't be said for sure that rhesus monkeys would behave in the same way in the wild. The monkeys weren't in their natural environment. The presence of psychologists and equipment is likely to have had some influence on their behaviour. So this experiment can't even be generalised out to all rhesus monkeys, never mind being generalised out to humans. Normally, laboratory experiments would be repeatable, but the extreme ethical issues present in this study mean that it hasn't been repeated, and in all likelihood never will be. There are many possible ways that the phenomenon of attachment can be explained, but one of the most popular is through learning theory. Quite often, learning theory is often known as behaviorism. According to learning theory, attachments form through the process known as conditioning. Conditioning can occur in two ways: classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is the gradual process of making connections between two different things in our immediate environment, like fire being hot, water being wet, home being safe, and food being, hopefully, delicious. As infants, at least, we all have very simple and straightforward basic physical desires: food, water, care, sleep, for example. Gradually, we learn that food, drink, parents, and beds fulfill these basic physical desires. Classical conditioning allows us to gradually make connections between our needs and our environment, and we gradually form attachments to the caregiver. In all likelihood, the caregiver provides for these needs, hence we make this attachment. Operant conditioning is a very similar process, but it operates in reverse. We feel hungry when we don't have enough food. Without water, we feel thirsty. Without sleep, we feel tired, for example. We still make connections. When our caregivers are present, they relieve these discomforts. The caregivers gradually become associated with the removal of discomfort, and hence we form an attachment. To an extent at least, learning theory is a little controversial. It does have some support from some scientific studies, but many people argue that it's reductionist in nature. It tries to reduce the very complex way in which human infants form attachments down to simplistic processes. It's also worth noting that a great deal of the evidence which backs up learning theory comes from the animal studies we've already seen. Unfortunately, these always have ethical issues, and they can't usually be generalized to humans. John Bowlby was an important and major figure in attachment psychology. Indeed, sometimes Bowlby is described, without evident irony, as the father of attachment psychology. He developed the monotropic theory of attachment as the first coherent explanation of how attachments form. In 1951, Bowlby put forward the idea that a very sophisticated type of imprinting, like Lorenz's geese, does occur in humans. We have an evolutionary need to form an attachment to our primary caregiver. If infants don't form this attachment, it becomes extremely unlikely that they'd survive for any significant length of time. As a result, therefore, natural selection and evolution prefers infants who do form attachments over those that don't. The idea of monotropy is that we form a single attachment as very young infants. This is obviously usually, but not always, our biological mother. Bowlby's basic idea was that this very first single attachment gives us a template or model, which we then roll out and use for all our future attachments, as slightly older infants, children, or adults. Therefore, if this very first important attachment is disrupted or abnormal, we then form abnormal or disrupted attachments throughout our adult lives too. There is a fair bit of evidence for Bowlby's ideas. That said, however, there is some experimental evidence against it, like the experiment done in 1964 by Schaffer and Emerson. One thing worth noting, and one illustrative point about the impact of psychology, is that Bowlby developed his theory during the 1950s. It was explained poorly by the media, but very widely publicised. It's been theorised that this contributed to a rapid increase in stay-at-home mothers during a socially conservative and very traditionalist era. There are three main basic types of attachment. They are secure, insecure avoidant, and insecure resistant. Secure attachments are a strong and usually permanent bond between an infant and that infant's primary caregiver. Happily, the vast majority of attachments are of this type. If the caregiver is removed for any reason, then the infant becomes distressed and unhappy, but is very easily calmed down when the caregiver comes back. Insecure avoidant attachments are a far weaker type of attachment. In these types, the infant is usually not particularly distressed or dismayed by the removal of the caregiver. Often they can be easily comforted by a complete stranger. Insecure resistant attachments are much more complex and multifaceted. Around the caregiver, the child is usually uneasy, stressed, or just apathetic, but they do become even more distressed if they're separated from that caregiver. In this case, however, comfort cannot be given by strangers, and the infant will then indeed often resist comfort when the caregiver comes back. Bowlby's theories would suggest that insecure avoidant and insecure resistance attachments will carry on and continue to impact on all the various future attachments and relationships that this infant may form as they grow through childhood and into being an adult, which may well cause them very significant difficulties in later life. Several experiments that were all carried out in the late 1970s and early 1980s have been classified under the general heading of strange situation research. Ainsworth, working in 1978, developed the idea of the strange situation. This is when an infant is placed in a situation which is new to them, and usually their primary caregiver is removed as well. The theory is that the nature and strength of this infant caregiver attachment can be accurately judged from how the infant reacts to this new, strange situation, to the removal of their caregiver, and finally how they react to the return of this caregiver. Working with a group of researchers in 1978, Ainsworth found that roughly 70%, or a little over 2/3 of infants, were securely attached to their caregiver. These group of infants were content with the presence of their caregiver and very happy upon their return. About 15% of the infants were insecure avoidant. They ignored their mother and were completely indifferent or apathetic to the mother leaving them and then returning. The final 15% were insecure resistant. They were uneasy while their mother was present, but they were upset when she left, and they couldn't be comforted by strangers. Very similar studies to this have been carried out in a range of cultures all over the world. This allows psychologists to judge if there are cultural norms in attachment. A meta-analysis was done in 1988 by Van Isgendon and Cronenberg. A meta-analysis is a study of many studies, and this one came to the conclusion that there are indeed cross-cultural similarities in how children are raised and how infants form attachment. That is, that there seem to be some trends present all across the world. That said, however, some subsequent research done later on has shown that there may be some cultural differences in how attachments form. Usually, it's thought that these are a result of cultural norms in very specific areas, like ideals of personal independence in Germany, and cultural norms of very strong family and religious ties in most Arab nations. It is generally thought that there are two main ways in which attachment can be broken or disrupted: separation and deprivation. Separation is, commonly enough, when a child is away from their primary caregiver for a relatively short period of time, like a few hours, maybe a day or two. Deprivation, on the other hand, is when something wanted or needed is removed on a permanent basis. Bowlby studied and focused on maternal deprivation, which is when an infant is deprived of maternal care for a long period of time during infancy. One landmark study was carried out by Bowlby in 1944 and is generally called the 44 Juvenile Thieves. This study looked at the backgrounds and specifically the infancy and childhood of 44 young delinquent criminals. Bowlby found that there was indeed a link between childhood maternal deprivation and criminality. Slightly later on, Robertson in 1968 also carried out a naturalistic observation of a single child named John, who was separated from his mother for a total of 9 days. This study concluded that this very short separation may have actually had a permanent damaging effect on John's relationship with his mother. When they were reunited after 9 days, John was extremely reluctant to be affectionate and pushed his mother away. Maternal deprivation, therefore, as put forward by Bowlby, has some evidence to back it up. In subsequent years, however, it's been argued this is very reductionist. Bowlby didn't consider other factors like poverty, social deprivation, or genetics. An institution, in the context of attachment psychology, is any organisation which takes care of children and infants in place of a normal family setting. Normally, we're talking about an orphanage. Fortunately, in Britain today, this is a very rare type of organisation. Through history, however, it was a sad and tragic reality for many children, especially in urban areas. Working in 2007, Rutter claimed that Bowlby had a very confused idea about deprivation. Rutter put forward definitions for deprivation and privation. Rutter suggested that deprivation is when a former attachment is broken, but privation is when an attachment never forms at all. Sadly, however, the difference between the two is academic. In reality, it's very hard to tell between them, and they have very similar consequences. In 1981, Rutter examined several case studies of privation. In each of these case studies, a secure attachment had never been formed by the child. One case study was the very sad one of Jeannie. This was first outlined by Curtis in 1977, and research actually continues to this day. Jeannie had been treated through her childhood with unimaginable cruelty by her parents. She never formed any kind of secure attachment and never had any kind of normal childhood. Jeannie was discovered by complete accident when she was 13. When she was discovered, she had almost no normal social skills whatsoever. But gradually, with competent care, she gained a very basic level of function. But she was never able to form any kind of normal relationships with anybody else. Today, she remains in the care of the state. In the early 1990s, the extremely brutal, authoritarian communist regime in Romania fell. This allowed the world and the world's media to see the country's many overcrowded orphanages containing thousands of children, all of whom needed a home. Many of these children were adopted by British families, and this gave psychologists an opportunity to study the effects of the orphanage on attachment. One landmark study was done by Rutter and a group of researchers in 2007. This was a longitudinal study done over several decades. The children were assessed and examined at roughly 6 months old, and then again at 4 years old, 6 years old, and finally at 11 years old. It was found that the effects of privation can be reversed if the child is adopted at a young enough age. It was identified that this age seems to be roughly 6 months old. Unfortunately, however, if the child is much older than this, then it seems the long-term effects of privation can never be fully reversed. This study essentially examined about 50 case studies over a great many years. It has huge levels of ecological validity. On the other hand, however, it is only a very small case study with a very small sample size. A very similar study was done by Hodges and Tizard in 1989, and this came to very similar conclusions, but it also had a very small sample size. As we've seen, a great many studies have been done on children in orphanages and also on them as adults in later life. These studies have suggested that there are 5 main possible consequences of children forming disrupted attachments at a young age. The first is affectionless psychopathy. The child will show little or no empathy and have almost no regard for how their actions impact upon others. The second is analytic depression. Generally, the child will show slow and impaired social development. This is usually combined with recurrent insomnia and inability to sleep properly, and often a lack of appetite. The third is deprivation dwarfism. Generally, the child will be physically underdeveloped as a result of sustained emotional deprivation. Fourth, and slightly controversially, delinquency. Generally, children who've had disrupted attachments at a young age tend to end up carrying out a series of minor crimes on a regular basis as they grow older. And fifth, reduced intelligence. Generally, the child's intellectual capacity will develop at a slower rate than normal. As we've seen, Bowlby developed the idea that our attachments as adults are guided by a template or model that we form as infants. If our infant attachments are disrupted or in some way abnormal, then it's likely our adult ones will be too. Bowlby called this theory the internal working model. Our infant attachments form a model or template for how we will interact with our peers as adults. If our infant attachments are secure, happy and healthy, then it's likely we'll go on to form normal, healthy, happy attachments as adults. On the other hand, however, if we suffer insecure avoidant or insecure resistant attachments as infants, then these will form our model for our adult attachments, which will also be resistant or avoidant. A landmark piece of research into this area was done by Hazan and Schaffer in 1987. They used a series of questions and questionnaires in local newspapers. to examine how the relationships of 620 people with their parents influenced their later expectations of adult romantic relationships. Indeed, they found a correlation between insecure avoidant and insecure resistant childhood attachments and abnormal or disrupted expectations of adult relationships. Some studies have rather sadly suggested that children who experience disruptive or abnormal attachments will go on to have difficulties in forming normal relationships with their own children. If this is the case, it would provide an explanation for a whole range of social problems, like recurrent deprivation, rising crime rates, and ingrained poverty and unemployment. Working in 1984, Quinton and a group of researchers compared the parenting of two groups of 50 women. The first group of 50 women had experienced institutional care as children themselves. The second group of 50 women had experienced a perfectly normal family life as children. It was found that the first group, that's the ones who had experienced institutional care as children, were far more likely to encounter difficulties or problems as parents themselves. The second group usually experienced perfectly normal parenting attachments. This would suggest that there is indeed a cycle of privation. Working in 1993, Parker and Forrest identified 4 symptoms experienced by individuals who tended to experience privation as children. The first is an inability to give or receive affection. The second is constant or recurring dishonesty. The third is poor or disrupted social relationships. And the fourth is delinquency or involvement in criminal behaviour. However, on a more positive final note, Freud and Dan, working in 1951, found that the majority of child refugees arriving in Britain during the Second World War went on to experience completely normal cognitive development and relationships as adults in the following decades. So it's not always all negative.